We've had,
Go ahead.
no, we've been very brave. We've had COVID, flu. I don't think we've had the other new one.
Neurovirus.
Yes.
Yes. No,
And
I and these are brave times. These are times that test our courage, right?
yeah,
Not only immunologically, but politically as well, which is what I'll talk with you about today. And so, as you can see, I am going to continue right where we left off. I'll do a little bit to connect the broader theme of the discussion that we're having to the news of the day or the week. I'll start out by saying I hope you don't think I'm belaboring these themes. John Campbell, actually, a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, said that this is serious, right? And I want to be as clear as possible. I do think that we are increasingly seeing an assault on the values and norms that sustain constitutional democracy in the United States. And we're seeing an opening for that assault to succeed. I want to be as clear as possible. I think roughly half of the population of the United States is not willing to go along with the agenda of Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again Republicans. But the issue here, of course, is that Trump is president, that the Republicans have control of Congress, that the judiciary is roughly evenly split, and that there is a majority of Supreme Court justices that were appointed by Republican presidents and seem to have some sympathy with Donald Trump's approach to expanding executive power and persecuting his rivals in a way that ultimately aims to silence or eliminate some of the pluralism of our society. And so having said that, it seems to me that this deserves the attention of everyone. That we need to be having a serious conversation that transcends the partisan polarization that accompanies American politics these days, and especially Donald Trump, who's proved to be such a divisive figure. We need to be thinking about, are there still principles, values, norms, laws that we hold in common that constitute the rules of our game and that allow us to have a structured contest of political ideas that still respects the freedom and equality of all members of our society? Or have we lost faith in that project? And are we now basically willing to approach politics simply as a naked struggle for mastery, domination, and power? And it certainly appears that some of the safeguards, some of, we like to call them the guardrails, I prefer the more normative language of values, norms, but also the legal language. These are constitutional requirements, they're principles, they're rights. Are we abandoning all of that? And if we're not, can we recognize it when a president or a party who roughly half of us support nevertheless constitutes a threat to the underlying safeguards of our system of constitutional democracy and unite or at least constitute a sufficiently broad coalition to say, pursue your agenda, but pursue it within the bounds of the Constitution, not against the understanding of what the Constitution permits and what the Constitution prohibits. That seems to me is a conversation that we are not adequately prepared to have, that we're not having, but it is the conversation of the moment. It is the most urgent thing for us to be discussing as we witness the assault on the constitutional norms coming out of this administration. So that's my reason for sharing with you the same slide, the same cast of characters. The title is slightly different this time, right? This is the second time I'm going to be talking about repairing constitutional consensus. If you remember, the jumping off point is the claim that constitutions do not interpret or administer or enforce themselves. Certainly, that's true of the American Constitution as well. I'm about to look at the little bit of the literature on the unwritten Constitution. The idea being that it is the people, and then in the highest offices in our polity, the president, the members of Congress, the members of the Supreme Court, who are ultimately in charge of interpreting our will, right? The sovereign authority in a democracy is ultimately the people themselves. And so we elect them in the hopes that they will pursue our agenda, respond to our interests, but also uphold our most important constitutional values. And so if we need a constitutional consensus to sustain a constitutional democracy, and yet if our constitutional consensus is frayed, because we are fractured, because we are so divided, because we are so also distracted by social media, by the entertainment complex of modern American society, by the spectacle of partisan conflict. How can we begin to rebuild what sustains a constitution, the culture of constitutional democracy, the political culture of our society? And at the same time, how can we begin to rebuild the capacity of the people to demand that our politicians actually adhere to the rules of the game? How can we rebuild our capacity to make them listen to us? So those are the two big topics I suggested last week. They operate in slightly different ways, right? Rebuilding civic power operates on the assumption that there is a shared civic morality or culture to American democracy. It centers on the Constitution and on the slow and unsteady march that we have made as a society toward better realizing our constitutional values. And that doesn't in any way mitigate, and I hope it doesn't neglect, the serious limitations and lapses, right? We were a slave society for longer than we weren't. We continued to practice racial disenfranchisement. We excluded women from the vote. We excluded unpropertied white men from the vote for a considerable period of time. There are many ways in which we have failed to live up to the values of our Constitution, but we have slowly progressed in the direction of a better realization of those values. And it is the hope of I think, right, the project that our founders set us on, that we would continue to make that progress. And that seems to be in jeopardy right now. And so building a constitutional consensus involves, as the name implies, reaching out to the people that we disagree with and trying to convince them, trying to make them return to their core commitments of justice and the way in which those are articulated by the Constitution. Rebuilding civic power, on the other hand, relies on a kind of organizing to hold those who are abandoning their constitutional commitments to account for their failure, to try to restore in them their sense of justice, not just by convincing them, but by saying to them, if you fail to do this, we have the organizational capacity to hold you to account, to get you out of office, to make your life more difficult. And so two different paths. I think they ultimately operate in tandem. I think, frankly, our constitutional consensus has been strongest when our civic capacity has been strongest. That's a tricky historical claim to provide evidence for, but that is my reading of American history. I certainly think, irrespective of that, in the current moment, we're not going to be able to counter the Trump administration and its assault on constitutional norms if we are not organized and reaching out to the people we disagree with to say to them, there's something deeper, more important than mere partisan advantage at stake in our politics right now. So to return, was somebody asking a question or making a comment?
You came in. Okay.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and mute people. I'm hearing a little bit of the background, but please remember you can unmute yourself whenever you want to. And you do that by holding your spacebar down or hitting that microphone icon. You can also put something in the chat whenever you want to. This diagram is mainly familiar. There's a website that is tracking the number of lawsuits that have been brought against the second Trump administration as a result of its heavy reliance on executive action. And we're up to 123 lawsuits right now. And this reflects a couple things that I think are worth emphasizing. The first is the sheer volume and velocity of executive action coming out of this administration, right? It is not trying to do things through Congress, which is slow, tedious work, right? And so it takes a long time, and so the lawsuits would be more slow developing. The Trump administration has really only tried to do one thing. We'll talk about the continuing resolution in a couple minutes, which is through Congress. It's done almost everything else exclusively through reliance on executive action. And this is, it seems to me, in and of itself, an assault on the separation of powers when the executive takes action that is essentially legislative action or that is directly contrary to what Congress has held the law to be, to the statutes that Congress has produced. That gets me to the second aspect of this, the second reason there are all these cases, which is the content, the substance of the executive action, much of which has been facially illegal or unconstitutional, right? Taking away birthright citizenship, abolishing an agency created by Congress, refusing to appropriate funds that have been dispersed by Congress, firing people whom Congress says you have to have cause to fire and you have to actually give 30 days notice. None of this has been abided by. Much of this is on its face illegal. And this then helps to account for why it is the Trump administration is caught up in court. What has really changed in the last week, and I think it's just really the culmination of now almost 2 months of action that is targeting the opposition, is targeting the capacity of the opposition to voice its criticism of the administration in a climate of freedom, in a climate in which you don't have to fear retaliation or reprisal for speaking your mind when you disagree with the president and the president's party, with powerful people. What has changed in the last week is increasing targeting of civil society actors. I'm thinking specifically of the action taken not only against a Columbia university student, Muhammad Khalil, and as it turns out, other students, right? Khalil is now in custody and facing deportation, despite the fact that he's a green card holder, married to an American citizen who is pregnant, and for no other reason than what he said during a protest, right? Being critical of the state of Israel. And to be as clear as possible, right? Using an obscure provision of a law in a very vague way to go after someone you don't like and to detain them and ultimately to expel them from the country is clearly calculated to have a chilling effect. Don't speak your mind, or we will find every little way we can to make life as difficult as possible for you. You shouldn't expect that you're not going to be audited by the IRS just because you've spoken your mind. You shouldn't expect that whatever way the federal government can make life difficult for you won't happen to you as long as you dare to speak your mind, to talk about the truth. A number of things I think are screaming for attention in this administration. Among them, right, I just love this one. The White House has a portion of its website that is a guide to the Constitution of the United States. That was taken down, right? This is a White House that does not want you to understand your constitutional rights. We add to this, and I'm going to go in a slightly different direction now. The fact that the continuing resolution was passed, right? That the um, uh, uh, Chuck Schumer and enough congressional Democratic senators went along with the Republican budget to keep government open. And look, there's an argument to be made, right? That giving Donald Trump the power to determine which portions of the government would remain funded and open and which ones wouldn't is giving him yet more power. And by the way, the people who work for the federal government, well, they rely on getting their payroll. They would be furloughed, and the people who rely on the services they provide, they would no longer get those services. I think, frankly, that sounds more like a rationalization of a political calculus, and it's a calculus of weakness. It reflects the intimidation that Donald Trump and his administration are successfully creating in the Democratic Party, which is at this point, I think, structurally weak. And so I'll just say this very quickly, right? What Schumer and colleagues signed off on is a budget that they object to and a budget that they had no part in negotiating, right? It's the congressional Republicans' budget. The congressional Republicans worked it out themselves without any involvement of the Democrats. And so the idea that the Democrats had an opportunity to say, if you want to pass a budget, you should, you must involve us. We are the other party. We got almost half the seats in this institution. We got almost half the votes in the most recent election. You can't bypass us. That's not the way this institution is supposed to work. But second, and most importantly, the values on one side of the scale, keeping government funded, keeping services flowing, keeping employees in their jobs, that's important. But the assault on civil liberties, the assault on pluralism, on our ability to hear the arguments against this administration in a climate that is not one of fear and intimidation is far more important than the value of the ongoing provision of governmental services. And so the idea that this was the moment to call attention, to say, look, this is not routine politics. In a routine political moment, sure, maybe we would fund the government for the next 6 months. I think it was a terrible capitulation on the part of Democrats in the Senate, and at the same time, an x-ray of the weakness of the party and its leadership. And so this leads me to suggest that the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party in Congress is not going to be a sufficient check on this administration, right? The way in which it's now going after the law firms that represent Democrats or critics or dissidents within this administration, the way in which it is trying to go after freedom of the press, excluding the AP, trying to bring pressure to bear on Jeff Bezos, which, by the way, he's all too willing to accede to. These are examples of a government and a leader who have no respect for the values and the norms of our Constitution. And so I just think that at this point, we don't have sufficient strength in the Democratic Party. Our last bulwark, as I say, is the courts. And by the way, it's an imperfect bulwark, right? There will be decisions where I'm pretty confident the Trump administration will lose. And one of the things that ultimately, right, is said about the Supreme Court, you have to be able to count to five. And I think a lot of attention is going to focus on Amy Coney Barrett and the question of whether or not she sides with the four conservatives or sides with the three liberals and, let us hope, John Roberts, right? But having said all of that, that then raises the question, will the Trump administration actually abide by court orders? We're not there yet, right? We're not in that full blown interinstitutional constitutional crisis we've talked about in the past. But please note, right, that Donald Trump's administration is appealing to the Supreme Court to curb the power of judges, to enjoin, to issue orders that prevent his executive actions from being implemented on a national basis, right? To limit their jurisdiction to the states in which they're seated primarily. And that would be a peculiar thing to do, to say the least, in the sense that the judges are interpreting national law or the national constitution and finding that the Trump administration is violating the law, not of California or Washington or Oregon or Rhode Island, but the law of the United States. And so when an injunction is issued, presumably it should have national scope. But the Trump administration is trying to undo that norm as well. So now let me pivot for a second. And here I want to draw on Akil Reed Amar, one of the foremost authorities on the Constitution, one of the most eminent constitutional scholars. He teaches at Yale Law. He's written a two-volume, they're both huge volumes. I can grab, give me 1 second. This is the one that I'm quoting to you from. I hope you can see, but it's a 600-page tome, and the other volume is America's Constitution, a biography, right? So a two-volume set, and I would point out to you, I think it's significant that the volume on the unwritten Constitution is larger and in a sense more ambitious than the volume on the written Constitution. This is why, this is what Amar says in justification for separating the treatment of the written from the unwritten Constitution. The phrases separation of powers, checks and balances, and the rule of law are absent from the written Constitution. But all these things are part of America's working constitutional system. part of America's unwritten Constitution. Since the written Constitution does not come with a complete set of instructions about how it should be construed, we must go beyond the text to make sense of the text. The written Constitution itself invites recourse to certain things outside the text. Sorry, that should be dash dash. Things that form America's unwritten Constitution. When viewed properly, America's unwritten Constitution supports and supplements the written Constitution without supplanting it. America's two constitutions, written and unwritten, cohere to form a single constitutional system. And so let me now give an illustration, right? And I'm going to quote the First Amendment. I assume that many of us probably could do this from memory. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's what the White House just took down from its website, that and its explanation of what the meaning of this amendment is. But I want to focus on something here for a moment. The phrase Congress shall make no law, and in particular abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. It doesn't say the president can't abridge the freedom of speech or of the press. I think the founders, or James Madison in this case, in introducing the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, what we call the Bill of Rights, although that's nowhere in the Constitution, that Madison was assuming, well, you don't need to say the president, because the president doesn't make law, and the president follows the law, and the president swears an oath to the Constitution, and in swearing an oath to the Constitution, he swears to uphold the freedom of speech and the press. But please note that all of that is implicit, implied. It's not explicitly stated in the text. And part of the reason is because, frankly, the text just can't say everything, right? It's meant to be a public document. It's meant to be accessible to everyone. It's meant to be something you can carry around in the breast pocket of your coat or in your handbag. It's meant to be something that informs our culture. And so it relies on the idea that the value of freedom of speech will be understood and internalized as a hallmark of democracy. And what Donald Trump is doing now in demanding that Columbia University put a department he apparently doesn't like into receivership before he will release $400 million in federal funding that the university relies on in its current operations, its scientific research, its programs, its financial aid for its students. This is a clear effort to say, we will do our best to control the institutions of civil society. The universities in this way are extremely important, as is the free press, as is the opposition political party. These are places where people freely collect information, explore sometimes radical, heterodox ideas, but do so in a climate of freedom of inquiry, in a climate of accountability to each other that depends on argument and discourse, on hearing each other, on listening to each other, debating and criticizing each other, and doing so with the only force being exercised as the force of the better argument, right? And that is not a coercive force. That is a suasive force. And Donald Trump and his administration are now trying to tamp damp down on that institutional context, the very beating heart of a vital free culture, right? And so yes, what he's doing with Columbia University, I don't know. Is it legal? Is it illegal? I suppose we will fall back on the bulwark of the judiciary to determine that. But is it in accord with the values of America's unwritten Constitution? I think the answer should be a ringing no. And that should, in and of itself, be a damning criticism of any elected official that they fail to adhere to the values of the constitutional structure that gives them the power that they are exercising. The reason we consent to have a president with all of that power is because we have limited what he can do with that power in advance through our Constitution. Donald Trump is showing himself to be an enemy of the values of that Constitution, and therefore someone who is violating the very terms according to which the power he has been given is meant to be exercised and constrained. This is disqualifying. And we should be very clear, this doesn't mean that he's going to be impeached. It doesn't mean that he should be in jail. But it does mean that on a nonpartisan basis, on the basis of our shared constitutional morality, we Americans should be saying to Donald Trump, too much. Stop. You have to pursue your agenda. You won the election. That gives you the right to do it within the bounds of the Constitution, written and unwritten, within the bounds of the law. All right, so I'm obviously animated about this. I believe that this is a serious assault on values that are constitutive of our freedom. But having said that, I also recognize that what I'm saying to you, you most likely already agree with, and frankly, it's not going to work by itself to do anything about what Donald Trump is doing. The question of what we do when half our society is deaf to the argument that this is a violation of constitutional values is a deeper question, a different question. How do we repair and restore a working constitutional consensus? So that's what I want to turn to, and I want to start with a little bit of information here. I will note, right, that Donald Trump has sunk back down into the negative approval territory. More people disapprove than approve of him. That may have to do primarily with tariffs and with his willingness, apparently, to wreck the not only American but global economy. Topic for another day, but it does appear to me that Donald Trump, in a sense, in his, well, I just maybe I need to be careful here, but there are people in his administration who want to disintegrate or unwind the global economy. And doing so is going to be incredibly destructive and incredibly painful. And that doesn't mean that the global economy is a great thing, right? I think there's much that is problematic about it, but it is an economy that 8 billion human beings are dependent on for sustenance. And we have to figure out if we do want to perhaps slowly disintegrate it or slowly limit the degree to which it is interconnected, how to do so while maintaining the capacity to feed all those people. Right. And it's not clear to me at all that Donald Trump has thought that through, that the people in his inner circle who appear to have a plan to begin to disintegrate the economy are really able to get Donald Trump to walk the tightrope that would be required to do this without massive economic destruction, that we're seeing that not only on Wall Street, but also in economic confidence. And that's certainly dragging his approval rating down. Though I would also note, right, this is still nearly a 50% approval rating. And when we compare that with the Democratic Party, right, and so there, the dotted lines are for the party, the solid lines are for Joe Biden, right? And please note, let's leave Biden out of it for now. The dotted lines indicate that, right, 60% of Americans disapprove of or have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party, right? So, in fact, it is less popular than Donald Trump. And to be as clear as possible, right, the Republican Party also has a net negative favorability rating. But note, right, that it's only 50% of Americans who disapprove of the Republican Party, and somewhere approaching 45% approve, right, which is much better than the Democratic Party. I do think some of that has to do with Joe Biden. I do think some of the better favorability of the Republican Party does have to do with Donald Trump. The Democratic Party is essentially leaderless right now and extraordinarily weak. And so even people who want a strong Democratic Party disapprove of it right now because of Chuck Schumer's capitulation or because of its incapacity to effectively counter Trump. But having said that, I think we have to recognize this goes back years, right? And it reflects the fact, frankly, that we have two minority parties in the United States right now. Neither party gets a majority of support from the electorate or a majority of approval. And that has been the case for a very long time. And that to the extent that the Republican Party manages to rally people to vote for it or the Democratic Party wins votes, it's very often because it convinces people to fear the other party, not because it evinces enthusiasm for its program or its candidates. And so we have two structurally weak political parties. We have a president who, as the charismatic leader of one of the two parties, is doing a little bit better. But then when we focus on the country as a whole, right? This is a recent poll. Which of the following comes closest to your opinion about our nation's political system? It has been broken for decades. Almost 60% of Americans agree with that. Slightly more Republicans than Democrats. Second most popular answer, it has been broken for the last few years. 30% of Americans roughly agree with that. So we're up to almost two-thirds of Americans who think, I'm sorry, I got to do my math. We're up to almost 90% of Americans who think that the system is either permanently broken or recently broken, and only around 10% who think it isn't broken, right? And so I think you put these diagrams together and what they represent. On the one hand, right, the two parties are not delivering accountability, responsiveness, or legislation that responds to most Americans' needs or interests. And this leads most Americans to believe both that the parties are not legitimate and that the political system as a whole is broken. And this creates an opening for Donald Trump to say, look, I know Congress is supposed to legislate and the president is supposed to execute, but how's that going? How's that working? It's been broken for a long time. Let me fix this for us, right? The opening comes out of the structural weakness of both parties. Donald Trump, I doubt, is actually that popular with the Republicans in the Senate. But having said that, right, they're intimidated by him and they will do what he tells them to do because if not, he has the cudgel of Elon Musk's money and of his popularity with his base to punish them. And Donald Trump can do what he's doing because so many people think the system is broken. Why should we continue to support the norms of the system? So last week, when we talked about the parties, I started with Daniel Schlossman's very influential scholarship on the parties. I'm going to reprise this very quickly for you. The idea that the political parties used to be anchored in social movements, the Democratic Party, especially in the labor union movement. The Republican Party originally in the abolitionist movement, the Republican Party more recently in the evangelical movement, but that as those movements have essentially lost steam, right? We have only about a quarter of the private sector unionized jobs that we used to have. The parties have become unmoored. They're no longer connected to autonomously organized social movements in civil society. And that leaves them exclusively reliant on political donors, exclusively reliant on political advertising, and paid functionaries to do their work. The unions used to recruit leaders, do get out the vote work, but also hold the party accountable and furnish the channels of communication between ordinary citizens and elected officials. Those channels have atrophied or broken down. The parties are cut loose from civil society. They are, as the more recent book by Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld puts it, hollowed out, right? They're mere vehicles into which charismatic candidates pour their personal programs, their channels for connecting donors to candidates, not connecting citizens to policy agendas. The other, I think, scholarship on the Congress that again, very briefly, because we've discussed it before, I want to call your attention to is the important work of Francis Lee on when Congress works and when Congress doesn't work. And so, in particular, Lee at Princeton University argues that our system of legislation and Jenny Mansbridge at Harvard refers to the theory of the legislature as a resistance theory. The idea being that our founders didn't want legislation to move quickly. They were frightened of centralized power. They were frightened of the democratic genies they'd let out of the bottle, and the majority of the American people would move too quickly following populist demagogues into legislation. And so they made it difficult to legislate. They made it such that two houses had to agree with each other. The president had to sign off. And then the Supreme Court had to uphold. They not only that, they created these institutions that operate according to different cycles. The Senate every 6 years, Congress every 2 years, and are elected on different bases, right? So that this meant there was a requirement of building consensus, of slowly persuading people, of working together. And then she points out, oh, yes, and by the way, for the last 40 odd years, we've had insecure majorities, essentially roughly even splits, as the diagram shows in the floor of the House of Representatives, between the Republicans and the Democrats. And that's actually anomalous. That if we look at the last, say, 160 odd years of history, for the majority of that history, for over 100 years, we had one party dominance. And in the period from the 1860s to the 1930s, that was the Republican Party in the aftermath of the Civil War. This is an index of two-party control. It includes both houses of Congress and the presidency. And so the higher up you are, the larger your majority is in Congress, plus controlling the presidency. So there are periods, right, in the period of Republican dominance where their hegemony is diminished, but there's never a period of strong Democratic control. And then beginning in the 1930s, the Democrats are the hegemonic party. And the result of their partisan dominance is that they are able to legislate. But for the last 40 odd years, post 1980, neither party has really dominated American politics. And the result is that Congress is much weaker as an institution, much less productive, much less able to create law that is responsive to the people's will, needs, interests. This is in part because we are less clear about what kind of policy program we want Congress to enact, but it's also to do with things to do with race and civil rights and geography and the ideological sorting of the parties. I don't think it means that there aren't issues on which the American people would like Congress to act. It's just that we no longer associate those issues clearly with one party or another, no longer therefore support one party over another in a consistent long-term way. So Ezra Klein, who was written about Francis Lee's work, points out, right, that you have different uh, ways of calculating a politician's interest in conditions of partisan parity as opposed to partisan dominance. In the condition of partisan dominance, if you're an individual politician, yeah, you got to run for office. You got to try to win the next election. But as soon as you've won the election, you get down to the business of governing. And by the way, if you're a member of the majority, you know you're in a stable majority and you work with your party. If you're a member of the minority, right, you know there's very little likelihood that we're going to win the majority in the next election or the election after that. And so to get stuff done, we need to actually persuade the majority party that we have good ideas. And so this tends to produce not only greater legislative action and success, but perhaps a little bit more of a spirit of bipartisanship. Similarly, right, the dominant party is not worried that working with members from the minority party is going to interfere with their capacity to win the next election. But in conditions of partisan parity, right? An individual politician wins the election. The next thing they got to think is, well, will my party be in the majority or not? And how can I make sure that my party will be in the majority next time round? And in the Americas of the 1980s forward, this has tended to remove the incentives for working with the other party, tended to, in the opposite direction, to make working across partisan lines a betrayal of party loyalty, a disadvantage in terms of competing to win the next election. And we see this in data about how Congress is doing. I start with the long-term view, right? And I note, right, that beginning in the 1860s, when the Republicans really began to take control of Congress, the amount of legislation that got produced in Congress went up dramatically. The same thing is true in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when the Democrats are primarily in control of Congress. And of course, that's the period of the New Deal and the vast expansion of the federal government. And please note, right, that beginning in the early 2000s, the productivity of Congress really diminished. And so if we look at this in a more fine-grained way, again, we can see even from the relatively low level of the early 2000s, it's continued to go down. And part of the reason it's continued to go down is because there's very little bipartisanship in Congress over the period from Ronald Reagan forward, right? And so we have inaction and we have drift, right? Our society is changing. Most obviously, we are becoming more unequal, and essential goods and services, housing, healthcare, education, retirement, childcare are becoming more and more expensive while wages are stagnating. And so we have an affordability crisis. And frankly, Congress has done far too little to address this. So more and more Americans feel, on the one hand, economically precarious. It's just hard for them to make ends meet. And on the other hand, they feel that they are not effectively listened to or represented, right? Government is not responsive. Elections do not generate accountability from political leaders. Why is that? And here we're back to, right, stuff that we've looked at on many times together before. When the preferences of the bottom 90% conflict with the preferences of the top 10%, frankly, congressional leaders don't care. Congress as a whole does not care, does not respond to, does not do what the 90% want them to do, but they do what the 10% want them to do. The 90% wants higher minimum wage. It wants higher Social Security benefits. It wants greater access to free higher education. And it doesn't matter that 70, 80, 90% of the people want that. That makes it no more likely for a piece of legislation to pass than if 10% want it. But when, right, the economic elite want a carried interest exception on their investments or lower corporate earning taxes, income taxes, when 70, 80% of them want it, it makes it much more likely that it's going to pass. So why is Congress, why is our political system responsive to the top 10%, but not the bottom 90%? The answer is relatively simple. The flood of money into American politics, the average spending on a congressional election is, in the last decade, 3 times what it was 40 years earlier. The idea that Citizens United in particular has opened the floodgates to dark money, to spending on super PACs. The idea that 0.01% of the population, and by the way, this is now up to 45% if we were to bring this data up to the current election cycle, right? We're now spending tens of billions of dollars on presidential elections, and a large plurality of that money is coming from a tiny minority of American families. And so, yes, our politics is non-responsive. Our income tax, in ways we've looked at before, has become more and more regressive, right? The wealthiest people are paying far less in 2018 than they were paying in 1950 or 1978. The least wealthy people are paying more in, right, the current tax code than they were paying before. And this is coinciding with growing inequality of income, right? And we've looked at this together many times before, but the idea that we've gone from being a society that was a really quite equal society, where especially the bottom 80% of society were very closely nestled together in terms of income, but even the top 20% were not in a different universe. Now the top 5% have just, achieved escape velocity. They no longer live in the same world that the bottom 80% live in, nor do the top 20%. And we see this especially in wealth, where the top 10% have two-thirds of the wealth, the bottom 50% have less than 2% of the wealth. This is the product both of global economic forces, but also of policy, of tax policy and other forms of policy, finally to humanize this, right? The idea that we're seeing an epidemic of deaths of despair, that it's hitting those in particular who are white and lack a college degree. That when we look at life expectancy, it's actually decreased for the poorest people in our society. This is especially remarkable for women, right, who are now living 5 years less the women born in 1960 than were the women born in 1930, where, I'm sorry, that's the low income women, the lowest income women, whereas the richest men and the richest women in our society are living maybe 10 years longer. This is in part because healthcare has become a luxury good. It's become so expensive to get good insurance, to get access to the cutting edge medicines and procedures. But it's also because, frankly, stress is the most important pathogen in our society, and people at the bottom of the economic ladder are feeling the most stress. And so you put all this together. I realize I've just sped through a lot of material, right? But our, right, parties are no longer anchored in civil society. There's partisan parity, which means Congress is no longer legislating. They are dependent on the hyper wealthy, which means to the extent that they do much of anything, they do things that exacerbate inequality. And the result is that people in our society are suffering. It is in this context, let me stop there, that Donald Trump is able to say, look, the old system, it just doesn't work anymore. We need a new system of government. And I want to say, you can't look at what I've just shared with you and say, he's just barking mad, right? He's dangerous. He's dangerous to the freedom of our society. He's dangerous to our economy. He's dangerous to our environment and global climate change. But having said that, he has a point. There is an opening for him to bring about executive autocracy, because the kind of government that we have and that we've relied on for the last, well, coming up on 250 years next year, is not working in the 21st century. And so one of the things we have to do if we're going to focus on making it work better is figure out how to get our parties rooted in civil society, how to get our civil society better organized. Writing a new check to the Democratic Party, it may be what you do because it's the only thing open to you right now. Writing a new check to an environmental advocacy group or the ACLU or a group working for freedom and civil society may, right, help you to feel a little bit of agency, but it's not the same as belonging to an organization that actually generates capacity. Let me stop there. I imagine you have thoughts and questions. Who wants to start us out today? John, go ahead.
Well, I'm kind of sorry I watched. I was feeling fairly cheerful this morning until I listened to all of this. I can't argue with any of it. I think you have it all right. But it sounds as you implied at the end that the only way to do it is a broad scale social movement of people within the United States to really have a coherent kind of opposition to everything that's going on. And I can't say I think the chances of that are very high.
Yeah, thank you, John, and I'm sorry for bringing you down, but I do, I'm not in the business of cheering us up when the news isn't cheery. But having said that, let me just point out very quickly that very often we don't see social movements coming, right? And so I was starting to put on the board. I keep getting to the cusp of doing this. I promise next week I will do this in greater detail. This is some literature that I'm looking at these days, and we've talked extensively together about Robert Putnam's work and a little bit about Kay Sabine Rahman and Holly Russell Gilman's work. There's new work I also want to share with you. Some of you may be familiar with Marshall Gans from the work he did with the California grape boycott in the 1970s, right? He was big with the agricultural organizing. And again, let me just ask, right? Did you see that coming? Did you have a sense that a boycott of grapes was going to lead to the organizing of the agricultural workers, was going to lead to much greater rights and better income and better working conditions? Or is that something that you didn't really know was coming until it arrived? And then I'll just add very quickly. It's often the case that it takes abysmal conditions to provoke sustained organizing, right? We don't just join movements because we got nothing better to do. We're working very hard. Unfortunately, in the 21st century, we're also extremely distracted, right? We've got all kinds of spectacle that we can digest in 20-second increments that can take up every spare moment of the day if we're not careful. And so yes, the conditions of life, but especially life in the 21st century, mean that we don't tend to get organized until there's something that really impels our action, right? And maybe, just maybe, the growing threat to our liberties, the growing threat to our constitutional norms, our unwritten and written constitution will be enough to impel us into action. I'm not predicting, I'm just saying let's not be despondent about this in advance. This seems like conditions that invite activism. I'm listening to whoever wants to go next. I just have to plug my computer in before it dies. So I'll be right back. Who wants to speak next, or who has a comment or a question?
David, I want to suggest that you get a more powerful computer battery. Most people
Uh,
can run their computer for an hour without it running out of electricity.
John, can you write a letter to the provost of Sarah Lawrence College, whose computer
Okay.
I'm using right now, and tell them I need a new computer? I would appreciate that. Um, yeah, maybe I'll break down and buy myself a new computer one of these days. But yes, it gets me about an hour and 8 minutes, and then it starts to die. Barbara, go ahead.
You spoke about how the current administration believes we just have to tear everything down in order to start fresh or to get rid of the bad things going on in our government. But I don't see the new government or the more lean government, whatever the goal seems to be, improving things because we've got the rich people at the top tearing things down. I mean, they're not going to be wanting to raise the income tax on the wealthy people. So, I mean, maybe the Democrats or we on the progressive end, we missed our chance because we didn't get the next president elected. Um, Although I think, well, that's what I want to say is, could have gone the other way. And, we've talked a good talk about the things that need to be improved. And I also might say that over our lifetime, plus the lifetimes of our parents and grandparents, things got better. I mean, we have more, we have better health care, we have health advances and other things, even though they're not extended to everyone.
Thank you, Barbara. And there are two things I would say there. And so I think if I've got it right, what I was talking about when I talked about tearing things down was really the economic agenda. And so I didn't speak about that at length in today's class, and I'm going to turn to that for a future class. And I have to say, still making up my mind about this aspect of this administration. I'm not inclined to believe that the global integration of the economy has been good uniformly for everyone in our society, let alone everyone in the world. And yet, I will point out to you, right, that there's been a vast reduction in global poverty. There's been a vast increase in global lifespans. There's been a vast increase in literacy, et cetera, right? And so in many ways, looked at from the big picture, mile high perspective, we're doing better. The human species is doing better in 2025 than it was doing in 1925, right? And that has a lot to do with the productivity of the global economy, even as it has wrecked the environment and introduced much greater inequality in many societies. So one of the questions is, to my mind, the really tricky question is, how do you limit the destructive aspects of the global economy without crashing the whole thing, right? And that's where I say it's a tightrope, and I don't know that Trump knows how to walk a tightrope, right? I'm pretty clear he doesn't. So that's one comment. But then your second comment is really about internal governmental reform, right? And there I completely agree with you. This is not governmental reform. This is, a effort to take a sledgehammer to the regulatory state, disguised as an effort to root out waste and corruption. And there's just tons of reporting on the fact that DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, is vastly overclaiming and misinterpreting, perhaps because they're incompetent, perhaps because they're disingenuous, all kinds of data. Right. And so, no, I completely agree with you. This is not an effort to fix the federal government. There is stuff that needs to be fixed. But again, that's a surgical operation. And frankly, yes, the Democrats are partly to blame for not having undertaken as much of the work to try to make governmental provision more efficient, governmental regulations less onerous. But having said that, it's so hard to legislate. It's so hard to get anything done. You kind of understand why those are not the battles that Barack Obama or Joe Biden have chosen to fight for that limited window in that narrow range of issues they can get anything done with. Right. So yeah. Thank you, Barbara. Bonita, go ahead.
Okay. One way to cheer ourselves up is to work locally. We have a mayor's race going on in Oakland when a woman who was one of the leaders of freedom and anti-war, Barbara Lee, is running for mayor. Now, I mean, she has to be elected because she was a congressperson. She was a famous congressperson, and now we have her here at home to help us out. So that should make us all feel better.
Thank you, Benita, and I completely agree. And I would add, look, um, we need to figure out how to resist what the Trump administration is doing. We need to demand of our national elected officials that they find their voice and their courage to do their best to thwart the Trump administration when what it's doing is illegal, unconstitutional, or immoral. But having said that, we're not going to get Donald Trump to wake up in the morning and decide he believes in climate change and that it's a top priority. So, where we can act while Trump is president to pursue the more positive agenda is locally, is at the state level. And that's going to be hard because Donald Trump and this administration are clear. They're going to use every tool at their disposal. There's good reason that the president of the United States has a lot of what people in constitutional law call prerogative power, right? The legislature, the Congress has given the president the authority to determine who gets a security clearance and who doesn't. And it tends to be pro forma. Any lawyer who's working on a case that needs to see secure documents and isn't a national security threat gets that security clearance, right? The Congress can't go person by person, lawyer by lawyer. It lets the Department of Justice handle that. Well, guess what? This president has decided to use Congress's grant of authority to persecute his enemies. And so it's going to be tricky. It's going to be hard to stand up to this administration, but we're going to have to demand that our state politicians, our local politicians, our national representatives continue doing the urgent work. And I think especially with climate change, if we don't continue making progress this decade, we're really in dangerous territory. So I completely agree with what you're saying, Benita. Work locally, work at the state level, work where you can while we suffer through the next 4 years. Iris, you've had your hand up? You're still muted, Iris. You got to unmute. You can probably just hold your space bar down.
Okay.
There you go.
I hope that's okay.
Yes.
I'm watching the local street activity that is really pushing for changes. And they don't have any national group to anchor themselves with. So they're kind of at loose ends, but they're not giving up the street. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for how we can help the street become more powerful.
So you can't see it, but behind you on my screen is Robert Putnam's The Upswing. And The Upswing tells the story of, quote, how America came together last century, right? And the idea is, right, that the New Deal didn't just come from FDR's brain trust. It came from 50 years of progressive organizing before FDR was elected. And it came from local experiments in government at the city or municipal level and at the state level. But it also came from things that were happening in churches, right? You know, schemes for old age insurance that were run not by governments, but by civil society associations. It came from labor unions. It came from what I believe you're calling the street, right? And so as opposed to thinking that every political movement has to very quickly coalesce into a national political movement, I think Putnam would suggest, I believe as well, that very often we need to move on 100 or 1,000 fronts at once, right? That sustained social change does not emanate exclusively from national political action, but it's a multi-front battle. And so I guess I would say I hope that what's happening in the street in Oakland is happening in the street many other places, and that eventually it networks and forms a more powerful union. But that we shouldn't expect it to immediately give rise to national organization. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That may be the best path to social change. We've gone over a lot today. Flossie, you've got your hand up. Can I ask you to be quick? You do need to unmute, Flossie. Can you hold your space bar down? You had it for a second, but it went away. Try one more time. Okay, good. Somebody's there to help.
I saw the death of the Democratic Party when I saw Nancy Pelosi at the big demonstration when Trump called everybody together to celebrate him. And Nancy Pelosi was dressed up. She wore beautiful, very handsome clothes. She had on a lot of makeup, but it was like a ghost. And I don't think anybody like Chuck Schumer can assume the leadership. He has too much of himself in it and not enough of the good of the country. In other words, like Trump, he wants a little bit of revenge too, and I don't trust him. So I'm looking for someone to trust. And I turn to the comedians who make us laugh. I look to them for leadership. They have money. They have children. They don't take themselves seriously. We need that, and we need Columbia University.
I go back to what John started out saying, that he was in a pretty good mood until he tuned into this today. And so yeah, I wish I were better at being funny, but I do think that this moment in politics lends itself, among other things, to satire. And so let's hope maybe one of them actually rises to the level where they can provide some leadership. Schumer, Pelosi, I think there's an awful lot of dependency on donors that is muting them, as well as just plain old intimidation. I do have to go. It was wonderful being with all of you again today. These are tricky, tough times. We get, I hope, some mutual support by talking about it together. Be well. I'll be back next week. I'll see everybody next week. Take care, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.